Hi, and welcome to this video on Spline Kit Pro. Today we're going to learn how to create a spline using Spline Kit Pro. It's going to be pretty basic. We're just going to look at creating a spline, editing the points, and some of the options that we have for doing so. So let's just go ahead and get started. First thing we're going to need to do, obviously, is create a spline. So you're just going to want to come over here to Game Object, down to Spline Kit Pro, and create new spline. You can see that we also have a shortcut, Shift-Alt-S if you prefer. You can use that. So let's go ahead and click that. You can see it creates us a new spline game object over here. And now we have that. Next thing we want to do is just add some points to our spline to define the curve. So let's go ahead and do that. To do that, you're just going to come into the scene view. You're going to hold down the Shift key and use the left mouse button to go ahead and click points in your scene, just like that. Now you may notice these little green points out here that you didn't really add. What those are they're the end control points, and they basically control the curvature of the spline near the end. Now when they're green, that means they're auto-managed by Spline Kit Pro, and that will be just fine for most cases. But if you ever find that you need to manage these yourself, you can. You just come over here to Setup and uncheck this Auto Manage Endpoints here. Okay, they turn red, and now you can select them and move them around, and you can see as I do that it changes the curvature near the end of the spline. Okay, but we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to leave them as managed here. So turn that back on. There we go. Okay, so here we go. We've created a spline, we've added some points, we've got a curve. Next, let's talk about how did Spline Kit Pro determine the depth at which to place these points. So for example, when we come in here and we add a new point, you can see, yeah, it added it where the mouse position is, but what about the depth? How far into the scene did it decide to put it, right? So if we rotate the camera, so I didn't mean to add a new point there. We rotate the camera, you can see that all of these points are in this plane here, okay? And so let's talk about how it decided to put it in that plane, and what the options are that you have to use for that. So we come over here to our spline, and we're going to look under the Edit menu here, and we see this field here, this point depth priority, okay? We've got three options here: collision, spline plane, and pivot. Okay, right now we don't have any collision in our scene, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Right now I just want to focus on these other two, the spline plane and this pivot. Okay, so each time you create a new spline, Spline Kit Pro automatically creates this spline editor plane right here underneath there, and you can turn it on if you like to kind of visualize it. And that is how we place the points currently. Because again, if you look back at this depth priority, it's the highest in the priority, so this is a priority. It'll look first for collision, then the spline plane, and then the pivot point. Okay, so the spline plane is just this. All right, and we can use this spline plane however we want. We can, let's just scale it down so we can kind of see it a little bit better here first. Let's make it maybe 500. Okay. Maybe 1,000 would be better. If I can type. Okay. Not really better, but you get the point. So now we can rotate this, for example, 90 degrees. And if we come here and select our spline, and we add a new point, you can see it added it to that spline plane. So we can rotate it, move it around, put it wherever we want, or orientate it however we want. For placing points. So you can use the spline plane for that. Now let's talk about the next one here, this pivot. So what happens if we don't find a spline plane to hit? For example, let's just say that we're right here and we add another point here. It didn't hit the spline plane, so what it did is it placed it at this pivot. What this pivot is, it's the distance from your scene camera, not your game camera, but your scene camera to its pivot point. So whenever you're in the scene and you're rotating it around, it's that distance. Okay, so that's where it placed it, that pivot point. Okay. Now again, like I was saying before, this is a priority. So let's say that we had our pivot first and then our spline plane. All right, and just move this spline plane forward a bit, just to kind of prove the point. Again, we have pivot as being the first priority. So if we come in here and we add a new point, you can see that even though it hit the spline plane, it didn't place it on the spline plane. It still placed it around the pivot. Okay. So again, if we change this spline plane to be first and we added a new point, so you can see it hit the spline plane. Okay. So that's that. Let's talk about editing points for a minute. It's just like basically any other game object in Unity. You can select a point, for example, use these axes to move it around, grab in the middle and freeform move it, right? Rotation and scaling. We don't use rotation and scaling on nodes to do anything in Spline Kit Pro. And instead, we use these blend nodes, which we'll talk about in a future video. So just note that there's no point to rotating or scaling a point in Spline Kit Pro. It just has no effect. Okay. So we'll go back there. And let's just take a quick look over here in the inspector again at some of these other fields. We've got these freeze, translation, rotation, and scale. And as I just mentioned, freeze, rotation, and scale have no effect on points. They do on blend nodes. Again, we'll talk about those later. So let's just look at the freeze translation for a minute. You can come in here and freeze an axis. So let's say we freeze Y. We select this point. You can see we can't move it in Y. Right? We can still move it in X, and we can still move it in Z, just like that. Okay. This next one, flatten. You can flatten all of the points in a spline to a plane if you like. That's all this is. You can give it a height offset, so you can flatten all the points, say, into the X plane or 5 units above the X plane, or whatever you like. This includes branches. With Spline Kit Pro, you can have, multiple branches off your spline, and if you do and you check that, it will also flatten your branches into that plane. Okay. Add nodes. We'll talk much more about this in later videos. But basically, it's just how you add a trigger node or rotation or scale or even a branch node along this spline. If we look at it really quick, you can see that if I move it along the spline, this little red box moves along, and that's where you can add something. So if we added a trigger node there, for example, we could place it right there. Okay, we're not going to do that right now. It's just for future reference. Okay. So let's look at these options down here. First one, make loop. If you wanted to make a seamless loop in Spline Kit Pro, you can. Just create a new spline here, and let's just say we had some sort of circle that we wanted to make a loop, something like that, right? You can go ahead and click make loop, and it will weld the first and the last points together, make a seamless loop, and anything animating over that will smoothly transition between those points. So it's just a whole spline. And then you can break it back apart if you want. You need to. Okay. The next one, center origin. If let's say that you created a new spline, but for whatever reason you came over here to start making the spline, right? You can see that the origin of the spline is still way back here, and maybe hard to find or something. So all this center origin is it recalculates the center of the spline and puts its transform there. So if we do that, you can see it just puts it back here, so we can easily find it again. Okay. Reverse spline, that will just reverse the order of the points and the triggers if you decide to do that, depending on which one you hit. Clear just clears the spline, deletes all the points, triggers, all that stuff. And recache, hopefully you never really have to worry about. But sometimes when you're upgrading maybe to a new version of Unity or something, you may need to recache the points for the spline. All that is it goes to the hierarchy and recaches those points and everything off into the spline data structures. So shouldn't have to really ever worry about that, but it's there if you need to. Okay. All right, so finally, let's talk about putting points on collision. So let's go ahead and just delete this one for a second. And I'm going to turn on this environment that I already have in the scene here. And find it, maybe. Let's just find some place in here to use. Just a nice place for a path or something. Trying to find something that's maybe a little, has a hill. Maybe that right there will do. Okay. So we come in here and we create a new spline. And we look under Edit here again and see that we've got our collision as the first thing. Let's say that we wanted to create a spline along this path right here. We can do that. It will follow the collision. So we'll just create our spline. Come down there, something like that. You can see that the points are all stuck to the collision. Okay. So I just wanted to show that so you could have something walk along some terrain. And excuse me. Now with this, the final thing I want to talk about here is the sculpt edit mode. So earlier we looked at how to edit points just using the standard way, standard kind of Unity way. There is another edit mode over here, this top one. And if you select sculpt, you will see that they all change to have these transform tools on them. And what this allows you to do, it allows you to easily manipulate and tweak the spline without having to try and select the point that you want to move. Sometimes that can be difficult, especially if you've got a lot of objects in your scene. So now you can just grab this and move these around, just like that, free form, or use the axes. Okay. Now, as I was saying, let's say that you have a point that is down here somewhere, okay, and you need to move it. Okay, if you are using the standard mode, it's kind of hard to hit that point, right, and select it. Of course you can go under here, but maybe there's more things that are, excuse me, obstructing it. This is where the sculpt mode comes in pretty handy. You can go back to sculpt mode, and now you can still see that handle, even though it's not the first thing. You can grab it and move it back up here, and just like that. Another handy feature with this is that if you look under render here, there's an option called always render. And if it's selected, that means that even if I have something else selected in the hierarchy, say that or that, just so it doesn't select everything, it's still drawn with the handles, and you can still grab these and still move them around even though the spline is not selected. Okay? So that can be handy. You can also turn that off, and if you select something else, you can see it's not rendered anymore. Okay. So that's basically sculpt mode, and it's a useful way to be able to tweak your spline easily. So that's the basics of creating a spline. Next time we're going to talk about how to animate an object along a spline. But if you have any questions or want me to cover anything else, just shoot me a mail, splinekit@gmail.com. I'll be happy to answer it. Maybe I can put it in a future video or figure something out. So thanks for watching.